like to second the statements of Joanna Glynn about the article. It was in the New York Times Magazine section by Emily Bazelon, having to do with shaken baby syndrome, shaken impact baby syndrome. And you're certainly right that the neuropathology, right, techniques you're discussing are not being used in American courts. And one of the real problems with this whole controversial area in the American courts has to do with the neuropathology, frankly, not being compared to the images. In that Woodward case, we had neuropathology evidence that there were osteoblasts at the site of the skull fracture, and somehow, well, eventually it did change the mind, as the article describes, of Dr. Patrick Barnes, who was the prosecution's witness in that case and who recanted his testimony and then sort of switched sides in the shaken impact baby syndrome cases because he realized that much of what he had been testifying to was not evidence-based science. But it was really quite extraordinary to have the neuropathology of what was actually in the brain. Here's a cell at the site of the skull fracture that shows that this is 3 weeks old, and yet people are looking at images and they're saying, oh, from this image I can tell that this was a baby that was slammed against a fixed hard surface at 26 miles an hour, even though there's no swelling at the site of the skull fracture. So don't get me started. That's the problem with being, as the Lord Justice said, a magpie. What I thought I would do is talk a little bit about one of the more developed areas of social science and the law having to do with eyewitness identification. But the statement that Reed Montague made yesterday, and he put in the Judge's Guide to Neuroscience book, struck me as extremely important. When he said, the important need is for a consistent informative measures across populations of humans, and I think here he was talking to neuroimagers, and methods for comparing individual responses to populations. In the near term, we think that mitigating neural deficits will most likely be restricted to individuals with demonstrable brain damage known to interfere with characterized mental function. I take it that's Mr. Oft, where you can really show something seriously is wrong in the brain with the neuroimaging. Anything more subtle than this awaits a new style of data collection, very large scale, and a coherent effort to understand the empirical and theoretical developments required to relate an individual's brain and behavioral responses to a population, but in a manner relevant to legal issues. These efforts will require a close collaboration between legal scholars, neuroscientists, and computer scientists. I couldn't agree more, and I think that a very good illustration of this that might be informative is something that's going on in this whole area of the law of eyewitness identification. And we are doing a case working with, I think, some of the leading, they are the leading experimental psychologists in this area, Dr. Gary Wells, Stephen Penrod, Jen Dysart, Roy Malpass, even when they disagree with each other on some small matters, they all testified at this one hearing in New Jersey that was ordered by the New Jersey Supreme Court in a case called State v. Henderson. And what's fascinating about this case is the way it started, and it's a very good illustration of a good way that law and science can interact. There is a test for the admission and regulation of eyewitness evidence that's been around for 30 years called the Manson test, where the courts, as I'll explain in a second, balance supposedly the corrupting effects of suggestions against certain reliability factors and then make some kind of a decision about whether the evidence comes into court or not, both an in-court identification and out-of-court identification. We filed a brief based on the 30 years of work of these experimental psychologists saying that this legal test was no longer appropriate in light of the science, and cited unbelievable amount of articles because in this field there are an unbelievable amount of peer review articles on this issue. And the New Jersey Supreme Court looked at us and said, that's very nice, but how do I know if you're telling me the truth? And then they did something which are done in complex, multi-district, toxic tort litigations and things of this nature. They remand, but very unusual in a criminal case. Maybe Steve can tell me if you've ever heard of this before, but I haven't. They remanded it to a special master a smart, experienced judge, and they said, hold a hearing, and you tell us whether this is true. And the question remanded was, is this test still legally appropriate in light of the new scientific developments? And we held a hearing for 2 years, and the judge came back and made a series of findings in a 54-page decision, and the answer was no. And in addition to that, even though he wasn't asked, we proposed a remedy, a new way of evaluating the evidence that actually it's what Reed Montague was talking about in his statement, as I'll explain in a second, for instructing juries on probabilities, tendencies established through meta-analyses over populations to better inform them their fact-finding in an individual case. In other words, here's what we know generally, looking at normal people generally about certain tendencies or probabilities, and so when certain events occur, we will inform you of that so you can take that into account in making the ultimate decision as to whether or not you think that identity has been established in this case beyond a reasonable doubt. And what's interesting is, and I quote here John Monahan, who we called as a witness, who I think is one of our leading authorities on law and social science, and he said, look, this field of eyewitness identification research is the gold standard for law and social science. We have more good peer-reviewed studies and good experiments in this area than we have in anything else. And we're studying here behavior, yes? The identification, the reason this has happened, I think, is identification procedures can be viewed as memory experiments. Every time you perform that lineup or photo array, or you use the Viper system in the United Kingdom where you do the videotapes of people's heads going at 180 degrees, that is a memory experiment. And we can pick out of that, and this is really Dr. Wells's work, system variables, variables we can control as to how you do that experiment, and then also look at certain estimator or event variables to try to make some judgment about how reliable or not reliable this identification may be. Frankly, what I got out of this, and listening to Anthony Wagner, and what I felt all along, what's ironic to me is that we need to fund more neuroscience research in this area so we better understand the mechanisms and processes underlying human facial recognition, the encoding, storage, and short-term and long-term memory, and retrieval, and the effects of all kinds of factors on that. Doing some of the neuroimaging on that can really help, I believe, in elucidating, helping us know what we should be doing in an area where we already have a lot of good data on how eyewitnesses behave under certain circumstances. The other reason why I think this is of enormous importance, obviously, as somebody that does my kind of work, is that eyewitness misidentification is the single greatest cause of the conviction of the innocent. 74% of the post-conviction DNA exonerations do involve eyewitness misidentification. And please keep in mind that post-conviction DNA work can only be done in, at best, 5% of criminal cases where there's some biology where you can do a DNA test. So what about the other 95% of the cases where there is no biology and you have eyewitness evidence? It's a matter of some pressing importance. So what do we know? These are all meta-analyses about certain system variables that are, I think, by anybody's estimations, pretty robust and accepted. Witness warnings, and I think Anthony had mentioned something about this yesterday, but if you just tell a witness the real perpetrator may not be in this photo array or the lineup, just by saying that, you will reduce the number of false hits without probably at all or even appreciably reducing the number of correct hits. Post-identification feedback. We know falsely inflates certain self-reports, which I'll describe in a second, are very important. And that could be just nodding or saying, yes, that's the right guy. And it doesn't have to be, by the way, from a law enforcement official. It can be from a regular person. It can be from the next-door neighbor. So we have to be careful about that. There's a lot of work on confidence and accuracy. Interestingly, tracking what Anthony said yesterday, but the most important thing to know about the confidence research is that the only confidence measure that's any good is the one that is taken at the time of the identification. So when the witness says, tell me in your own words, well, how confident are you that this is the person, that is the only measure that correlates in any way with reliability. There is some calibration studies that were very interestingly reflected in what Anthony was saying yesterday, and that is among those where you take the pristine confidence measure at the time of the identification, among highly confident witnesses, there is something of a in some studies have shown a higher accuracy rate. But overall, frankly, confidence, even taken with a pristine measure at the time of the identification, really has a low-level correlation with accuracy. Now, of course, what's crazy about that, if the only measure that's really probative in all this research is the confidence level at the time of the identification, then why are we letting all these witnesses get on the stand and look at the individual and go, that's the man, I'll never forget that face as long as I live, and put so much evidence on the in-court identification without telling juries that's among, diagnostically, the least probative piece of evidence in terms of whether this is an accurate and reliable identification. So what we tell jurors, I would submit to you, based on a lot of these meta-analyses as we're proposing in this Henderson case, makes a big difference. Mugshot exposure and mugshot commitment, if you identify somebody's photo and then you see them again in a live lineup, you're going to be you will still make an error if you made an error the first time on the mugshot when you look at the live person. Unconscious transference, lineup presentations, sequential versus simultaneous, confirming feedback, no time to show you, but this is very, very dramatic stuff about confirming feedback and how that falsely inflates witness self-reports. Now, why that's important, I went a little too quickly, and this is the key to what we wound up doing in the Henderson case. The way the law reasons about the evaluation of eyewitness testimony is they, on the one hand, will look and see if there was a suggestive identification procedure, which studies, meta-analyses show just the use of a suggestive procedure itself will inflate self-reports about opportunity to observe, how much the witness believes they had an opportunity to observe, attention paid, or their certainty or confidence in the identification. Now, what the court said is we're going to balance the suggestion, against these so-called reliability factors in order to decide whether to admit eyewitness testimony. The problem with that balance test is that it's a scientific confound, because once you have the suggestion or the post-identification feedback, you're falsely inflating, the opportunity to observe, the degree of attention, the confidence, and you can't balance that because you've confounded it, all right? So what do you do? And incidentally, other factors which, are real factors and when you're doing the real science here is accuracy of the description and, most importantly, the time between the crime and the confrontation itself. The identification procedure is extremely important, and I think actually people in the UK, you should be doing these procedures faster, but we'll get to that because of the forgetting curve. So in any event, this whole thing is screwed up. It's a fundamental confound. So how will courts deal with this? All right. Other things that the neuroimagers really could help us with. Other meta-analyses that we know, what we call estimator or event variables that will affect the reliability of the eyewitness identification. Cross-racial identification, whether you're in a minority or a majority population. It's true in Africa for blacks relative to whites, just as it's true here for whites relative to blacks. That is hardwired, it appears. Incidentally, the studies show it doesn't get much better with experience, that people from different races are not very good. They have a higher error rate. Stress. It's very hard in the laboratory to simulate stress, but maybe the neuroimagers could give us a much better idea of what constitutes stress that may get in the way of reliable encoding, storage, and retrieval of memories. Weapon focus. Obviously, that's a meta that can impair identification. And then, of course, retention interval, how long between the time of the identification and the actual viewing. Witness age, description of it, these are all some pretty good neuros. Here, meta-analyses. Here, let me show you something that was developed by Jeffrey Loftus, which was a neuroscientific piece of work that also involved computer experts over populations, just as Montague was talking about. And this is a terrific thing that every criminal lawyer ought to know. Because one thing you actually can find out is sometimes a witness will say, I was on the corner of Hollywood and Vine, and then I saw the observation, the person over there, and they can give a landmark, and we can actually go out and we can measure how far the witness was from the person when they made the observation. Well, look at this. Loftus and his colleagues did a study of what it would look like replicating for the jury the level of distortion on face recognition that can be caused by distance. So that's what, with 20/20 eyesight under normal lighting conditions, a face looks like at 134 feet. And that's 100 feet, and that's 5 feet. And that's Julia Roberts, by the way. Somebody that you know. Now that's a pretty good application, isn't it, of what neuroscience and computer experts can do. So our judge in Henderson, Jeffrey Golkin, terrific guy, said what's obvious. Memory doesn't work like a videotape. Eyewitness memory is a form of trace evidence. Just to show you the law-science divide, okay? Lisa knows about this, is that, you say it has very good legal, it's a very good legal analogy to talk about this as trace evidence because you can contaminate memory, and so it has legal implications as to how one best would handle this in terms of putting the burden on the prosecution of going forward, presenting the witness, talking about the procedures, and then having the focus of the inquiry being on what could or could not contaminate the memory. But when you say it's a form of trace evidence, then I think neurosciences would agree, well, yeah, long-term and short-term memory is it's a trace on the brain. Where else is it? I mean, it has neurochemical properties, my God. And people, courts and judges and people are saying, what are you, crazy? What do you mean? It's trace evidence? I don't understand that. Well, it is. And contamination of eyewitness memory is irreparable. Your memory doesn't get better over time. That's what the studies show. And contamination can come from not state actors, and these are memory experiments, and, well, I could go on. Basically, what we came up with is a new legal framework for how to deal with eyewitness evidence, is that in every case, once the defendant says, I wasn't the guy, I'm putting the issue of identity question of identity into issue, then the prosecutor has to go forward and basically, A, put on the witness who's offering an opinion that that's the person, so they can tell us in every case what it is they saw and heard. All right? So a judge can evaluate that. And they don't have to meet a very high evidentiary threshold, by the way. For the lawyers in the room, it would be a 104B conditional relevance thing. Can any juror believe this identification beyond a reasonable doubt? It's not a very high burden of proof. And then the prosecution must put something on about how the identification was made. And what you'll see from the eyewitness researchers is both in the United States and in the United Kingdom, we have a pretty good consensus on a lot of the best practices that we know so far from the meta-analyses as to how to conduct these eyewitness procedures. What the right witness warning is, as I've described, how to take the confidence statement at the time of the identification, that the identification procedures must be done in a double-blind fashion. That is, the administrator should know who the suspect is. A lot of this, there's some controversy about whether it helps or hurts to have a sequential presentation. There's no question a sequential presentation showing people one at a time will reduce false hits, but it also reduces correct hits, and as to how much and as to whether that's a proper trade-off, reasonable people can certainly differ. One interesting difference that would be great to get some good neuroimaging research, if nothing else, or at least figure out why, is that in the United Kingdom, it's quite fascinating, that in the so-called VIPER system, I think there's one other competing system, too, if I'm not mistaken. But for Americans, what they do is that they get a person who may be suspected of being a criminal, and they will immediately rush to that individual, and they will take a videotape of the person moving his head back and forth for 15 seconds. And then there is a library of videos that they import to create fillers, right, for the identification procedure, and then one at a time sequentially, the witness will view them, and I think goes through it 2 times, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right?
I think so.
At least, right, which may be a problem because there's these whole problems of making relative judgments and comparisons. The problem with that system, I would submit to you, though, is that it takes a while. You do it very fast, but it takes a while, right? And so the quicker you can do an identification procedure, because the curve for forgetting is so steep and so quick, the better, I would think. And so the question is, what's the fastest way to get, let's say, a photo array, well-designed, non-suggestive, to the witness, maybe with a handheld computer device would be a great thing to do. I'm more than done, am I not? I think I went over? Okay. Sorry about that. And I could go on about this, but I think the most important part is that what we are on the verge of doing now in this field is, because we have data across populations about tendencies, we really can instruct jurors. If you fail to give this warning that the real perpetrator might not be there, that increases the risk of misidentification. Please take that into account when you consider the evidence. British judges would have no problem marshaling the evidence or saying something like that. American judges, I think, would drop that in a cold faint before you would give that instruction, but the science does dictate it. And there are other metas, other real good studies, other real data that can be used to tell judges about what these tendencies are across populations that they should know before they make the factual determination on identity.